Strong bones, white teeth, and the image of a milk-drinking child beaming with health. Well, what if I told you that everything you know about milk is a lie? This isn't just about calcium, my friends. It's about decades of calculated deception, billions of dollars in profit, and one of the most pervasive marketing campaigns in history. Welcome to the Milkspiracy. Our story begins in the early 20th century, at a time when milk wasn't the household staple that it is today. Before refrigeration, milk had a reputation for being dangerous, unpasteurized, and a potential carrier for disease and sickness. But everything changed with one pivotal moment, World War II. During the war, the US government needed a way to support dairy farmers while ensuring soldiers received enough calories and nutrients. Enter the National Dairy Council, an organization backed by government subsidies and armed with a mission: convince the public that milk wasn't just a drink, but an essential drink. The Dairy Council, alongside Madison Avenue's top ad agencies, launched an unprecedented campaign. The key message? Milk builds strong bones. But this wasn't backed by groundbreaking science, it was backed by a desire to sell surplus milk. You see, in the 1940s, milk production had far outpaced demand, and farmers were drowning in excess supply. They targeted parents with images of healthy, happy children. Advertisements showed athletes chugging milk, emphasizing strength and vitality. Schools were lobbied to include milk in all lunch programs, further embedding the idea that milk was synonymous with health. The cornerstone of this campaign was calcium. While it's true that calcium is important for bone health, the claim that milk is the best or even a necessary source was wildly exaggerated. Other foods like leafy greens, almonds, and fortified plant-based options provide just as much calcium without the downsides of milk, like lactose or saturated fat. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite the evidence, the dairy industry leaned into selective science, because behind every great marketing campaign lies a foundation of science, or at least the illusion of a foundation. To cement the milk narrative, the dairy industry poured millions into funding studies that aligned with their agenda. Many of these studies focused on the link between milk, calcium, and bone health. Researchers were tasked with proving a specific hypothesis, that milk consumption directly correlates with stronger bones. And they delivered, though not always through rigorous and unbiased methods, of course. In one famous example, a study funded by the National Dairy Council claimed that drinking 3 glasses of milk a day significantly reduced the risk of fractures. But what it didn't highlight was the limited sample size. It excluded participants with lactose intolerance and downplayed data that showed very diminishing returns with excessive milk consumption. The dairy industry also leaned heavily on partnerships with health professionals. By funding studies and conferences, they gained endorsements from dietitians and medical associations, lending credibility to their claims. The American Academy of Pediatrics and even government nutrition guidelines recommended milk as a staple of a healthy diet, largely due to lobbying and financial influence. These conflicts of interests weren't always disclosed, leaving the public to trust a narrative shaped by organizations with a vested interest in selling you milk. The result? Decades of policies, school programs, and nutritional advice rooted in profit rather than truth. But here's the catch. When you control the funding, you often control the outcome. And that outcome was an entire generation of people who grew up believing milk was irreplaceable. And while the dairy industry was busy funding supportive studies, they were also actively suppressing information that would challenge their narrative. Organizations found themselves up against a well-funded machine determined to keep dissenting voices quiet. Notice the pattern here? In the 1980s, a groundbreaking study suggested that plant-based calcium sources could be just as effective as dairy for bone health without the drawbacks. The dairy industry responded swiftly, leveraging its connections to university boards to bury this research. Funding for the researchers' future projects mysteriously dried up, and the study was quietly shelved. Government nutrition guidelines were another battleground. Advocacy groups attempting to promote plant-based diets or alternatives to milk often faced intense lobbying efforts from the dairy industry, Critics accused the USDA's dietary guidelines of being more reflective of industry influence than scientific consensus. Leaked internal documents revealed how the industry employed public relation firms to discredit critics. Campaigns targeted journalists, portraying them as biased or uninformed, while scientists questioning milk's benefits found their reputations attacked and their work dismissed as junk science. Even as plant-based alternatives gained traction, the dairy industry fought back with aggressive marketing campaigns and legislative efforts to prevent non-dairy products from being labeled as milk. Why? Because any crack in the narrative could threaten an empire raking in billions. And whose empire was that? Well, the Rockefellers, of course. Pasteurized milk was a symbol of safety and progress to most, but really it was about profit and control. And at the center of all of it was the Rockefeller dynasty. Back in the early 20th century, milk was mostly raw and locally sourced, and it wasn't just a drink. It was a nutrient-dense superfood, rich in probiotics, enzymes, and natural vitamins. But this natural elixir presented a problem for the emerging industrial complex. It couldn't be standardized, centralized, or mass-produced. Enter John D. Rockefeller, the oil baron who transformed his wealth into unprecedented power. He wasn't just building oil empires, he was laying the groundwork for big pharma and industrial agriculture. To make his medical and pharmaceutical interests profitable, Rockefeller needed one thing: a way to redefine health and sickness. And milk was a perfect target. At the time, public health officials, most of whom were funded by Rockefeller foundations, began warning of the dangers of raw milk. True, there was occasional outbreaks of illness and salmonella due to poor hygiene in urban dairies, but instead of addressing the root causes of that, unsanitary farming practices, they proposed a radical solution: pasteurization. By applying heat to milk, harmful bacteria could be killed, making it safer for the masses, or so they claimed. But pasteurization wasn't about public health, it was about profit. It was about power. By forcing milk to be pasteurized, Rockefeller and his allies could consolidate the entire dairy industry. Small local farmers who couldn't afford pasteurization equipment were pushed out of business, leaving industrial producers to dominate the entire market. And there was another hidden benefit too. Pasteurization stripped milk of its natural probiotics, enzymes, and vitamins, making it harder for people to absorb its nutrients. And who profited from that? The pharmaceutical industry, which Rockefeller was heavily invested in, to say the least. After all, if people couldn't get their nutrients from milk, they'd have to turn to synthetic vitamins, supplements, and medications, products conveniently controlled by Rockefeller-linked companies. In fact, the rise of pasteurized milk coincided with the rise of synthetic vitamin production. Companies like Standard Oil's Byproducts division developed ways to mass produce vitamins like D3, which were then marketed as essential additives for pasteurized milk. The narrative was clear. Pasteurized milk needed to be fortified because it was nutritionally inferior. And who profited from that fortification? You guessed it, the Rockefellers' sprawling industrial monopolies. As pasteurization became the norm, raw milk didn't just fall out of favor. It was actively suppressed. Laws were passed banning the sale of raw milk in nearly every state, and those who defied those regulations were targeted. Small farmers became criminals overnight for selling a product that humans had consumed for thousands and thousands of years with little to no issue. And yet, despite the smear campaigns, scientific studies have confirmed what raw milk advocates have long argued. Raw milk, when sourced responsibly, is not only safe, but it is incredibly nutritious. It contains beneficial bacteria that support gut health, enzymes that aid digestion, and vitamins in their natural, bioavailable forms. Pasteurized milk, by contrast, is a shadow of its former self, a product that's been stripped of its own essence in the name of corporate profit. And how much profit are we talking about anyway? By the 1950s, the US dairy industry was raking in billions annually, much of it funneled from government programs like school lunch subsidies. And they didn't just stop there. In the 90s, the infamous Got Milk campaign reignited sales, featuring celebrities like Michael Jordan and Britney Spears, all with that iconic milk mustache. The campaign cost $23 million annually at its peak, but the payoff was massive. Milk sales surged, and the narrative of milk as a health essential reached a new height. By the end of the 20th century, the dairy industry was valued at over $50 billion. But not everyone bought into the hype. As the plant-based movement gained traction, more people began questioning the milk narrative. Studies emerged debunking the claim that milk prevents fractures or osteoporosis in adults. In fact, some research suggested the opposite. Excessive milk consumption might even weaken bones. But the dairy industry doubled down, funding counter-studies and flooding social media with pro-milk messaging. Yet the cracks in the foundation of their narrative had already begun to show. Today, milk consumption in the United States has declined significantly, yet the myth persists. Why? Because propaganda that deep doesn't just fade, it becomes culture. The idea of milk as essential for strong bones isn't just a slogan anymore. It's an inherited belief passed down like a family recipe. Is milk inherently bad? No, not necessarily. But the story we've been told, that it's the only path to health and strong bones, isn't just misleading. It's marketing, plain and simple. In the end, the story of milk isn't just about what we were told, it's about what we were not told. The studies we saw were funded by those who stood to profit, and the truths that didn't fit the narrative were buried. So the next time you reach for a glass of milk, ask yourself, are you drinking it because it's your choice, or because it's a choice that was made for you decades ago? Stay curious, question everything, and always dig deeper. This has been the Milkspiracy. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Far Out Forensics, my friends. Please support our mission to shine a light on the flip side of the human experience by liking, subscribing, and sharing this video. Until next time, I'm Faust Checho, reminding you to question the answers.